My name is Layla, and I am going to tell you how I became a prisoner of my own mind, because I couldn't accept that I was the reason my mother's heart stopped beating. It all started on a Tuesday night during the worst storm of the year, when the power went out, and the wind was howling so loudly that it drowned out the sound of my mother's labored breathing in the next room. I was exhausted from working double shifts, and I fell asleep on the kitchen table, forgetting that her heart medication was still sitting there in the plastic cup. When I woke up hours later, the house was freezing, and the silence was so heavy that I ran to her room, finding her sitting upright in her favorite rocking chair by the window. Her eyes were open, and she was staring at the dark garden. So I assumed she had just woken up before me and was waiting for her breakfast. I spoke to her, and she didn't answer. But she had been getting quieter for months due to her dementia. So I just figured it was another bad day. I carried her to the kitchen, noticing she felt unusually heavy and stiff. But I told myself it was just the cold from the power outage affecting her joints. I prepared her favorite oatmeal and sat in front of her, feeding her spoonful by spoonful. Even though most of the food just slid out of the corner of her mouth and onto her nightgown, I cleaned her face with a warm cloth and talked about my plans for the day, convinced that I saw her pupils dilate when the sun finally broke through the clouds. Every time I moved her arms to change her clothes, I heard a faint clicking sound in her shoulders, which I rationalized as simple arthritis from years of hard manual labor. The house began to smell a bit musty after the second day, but I blamed the damp walls and the old carpets that had soaked up the rainwater during the storm. I spent hours brushing her thin white hair and telling her stories about my childhood, ignoring the fact that her skin was starting to take on a pale, waxy yellow tint. I even moved her chair closer to the TV so we could watch her favorite game shows together. And I would laugh at the jokes and then look at her, believing her frozen expression was a sign of quiet enjoyment. When her fingers started to turn a dark, bruised purple, I convinced myself she just had poor circulation, and I wrapped her hands in thick wool mittens to keep them warm. I was so deep in my routine of checking her pulse, which I imagined I felt in my own thumping fingertips, that I never once thought about calling a doctor or asking for help. My life became a cycle of cooking meals for a woman who couldn't eat and sharing secrets with a woman who couldn't hear, all to drown out the guilt of that missed dose of medicine. I would stay up late at night sitting at her feet, watching the moonlight hit her face, and I truly believed we were closer than we had ever been in our entire lives. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. The third week began with a heat wave that turned the small house into an oven and made the air so thick that I had to crack every window just to breathe properly. I noticed that the mittens I put on my mother's hands were now sticking to her skin. But I forced myself to believe it was just sweat and humidity. I continued to lift her from the chair to the bed every night, even though the skin on her arms felt like wet paper that might tear if I gripped her too tightly. To combat the worsening smell, I bought dozens of scented candles and air fresheners, lining them up on every shelf until the scent of artificial lavender was nauseatingly strong. One morning, I noticed a fly buzzing around her ear, and I swatted it away with a frantic energy, screaming at the insect for disturbing her peace. I began to notice that her eyes were becoming cloudy and sunken. But I told myself it was just the natural progression of her illness, and that she was simply tired of fighting. I started using heavy makeup on her cheeks to give her back the color she had lost, carefully applying rouge and lipstick to a face that was becoming increasingly unrecognizable. My daily conversations became longer and more desperate as I pleaded with her to just give me a sign that she had forgiven me for that night in the storm. I would hold her hand during dinner and tell her that the neighbors were asking about her, inventing elaborate lies about the people on our street just to keep the fantasy alive. The flies became harder to manage, and I found myself spending hours every day cleaning the floor around her rocking chair, where strange fluids had begun to leak from her slippers. I bought a heavy-duty fan to point directly at her, thinking the cool air would help her rest better. But it only served to circulate the stench of decay throughout the entire building. My own clothes started to carry the scent, and when I went to the grocery store, people stepped away from me in the aisles. But I just thought they were being rude. I came home and locked the door, feeling safe only when I was back in the room with the woman who had become a statue of my own making. I started to see small movements in the folds of her dress out of the corner of my eye. But I told myself it was just the wind from the fan blowing the fabric. I was spending all my money on expensive perfumes to pour over her bedding, desperate to mask the reality that was literally rotting right in front of my face. Every time I touched her, a part of me knew the truth, but the part of me that loved her was much stronger and much more dangerous. I was living in a waking nightmare where the lines between the living and the dead had completely vanished under the weight of my crushing sorrow. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was preparing a simple vegetable soup and humming a tune that my mother used to sing to me when I was a little girl. I walked into the living room with a tray and a sharp kitchen knife to cut some bread. And as I reached over to adjust her bib, the knife slipped from my sweaty palm. The blade fell straight down and buried itself inches deep into the top of my mother's foot. But there was no scream, no flinch, and not a single drop of red blood. I stared at the wound as a thick, blackened fluid slowly seeped out around the metal, and the silence of the house suddenly felt like a physical blow to my chest. I looked up at at her face and saw that a large piece of the makeup I had applied had peeled away, revealing the gray, leathery flesh of a woman who had been dead for nearly a month. The music in my head stopped instantly, and the artificial lavender scent was replaced by the overwhelming, suffocating reality of a decomposing corpse in my living room. I realized then that the breathing I heard at night was just the house settling, and the smiles I saw were just the skin tightening over her skull as it dried out. I dropped to my knees and pulled the knife out, watching in horror as a cluster of larvae spilled out of the opening I had just made in her foot. My mind finally snapped as I looked at the medicine cup still sitting on the table, the same one from the night of the storm, reminding me that I had killed her with my own exhaustion. I didn't call for an ambulance because I knew there was nothing left to save, and I couldn't bear the thought of strangers seeing what I had allowed to happen. I sat there on the floor for hours, watching the sun go down and the shadows stretch across the room until they touched the feet of the woman I had turned into a macabre doll. I realized I couldn't live in a world where she was gone, and I couldn't live in a world where I was her murderer. So I picked up the medicine bottle. I swallowed every pill in the container while sitting right next to her, resting my head on her cold, bony knee for the very last time. I felt my own heart begin to slow down, and I closed my eyes, grateful that the silence was finally going to be permanent for both of us. The last thing I felt was the rough texture of her lace dress against my cheek as I drifted into the same darkness that had taken her weeks ago. I left us there together, two bodies in a quiet house, waiting for someone to eventually find the door and discover the cost of a daughter's broken heart. One last question: if you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.